Come on, guys. All right, I was going to talk about some other stuff, ham radio related. Um, I make videos and was talking about how I don't talk on the radio anymore, really. Well, not even at all. But so that's beside the point. But the fact is that I do listen a lot, and I check the radio when I get in the truck because I have a mobile in the truck. I listen to the scanner a lot. But one of the things I wanted to talk about was kind of this ideology of where you have to have like this high dollar radio, super antenna, you need to have a tower, you need to have an amplifier, you need to have all this stuff. It's simply just not true. It's kind of like some ego thing for a lot of people. You don't need a $3,000 radio to talk all over the world. And there's a certain point where there's a diminish of return on investment. So you could use an ICOM 718, which used to be considered like the biggest piece of crap radio, but reliable. Now they've since changed it, so it's not even the same radio anymore. It just looks the same. But like you could have one of those, or you could have whatever. Like when I got started, it was the Pro 3 or the Pro 2. That was the radio to have. There really wasn't anything else above that most people would have. Maybe there was people had the 5,000, the 9,000, and stuff like that. And I don't know what Kenwood might have been out on the market. And the ICOM probably had 7,800. But it was basically, if I'm not mistaken, the Pro 3 was close to $3,000. I think 2,800 or something. Anyway, it wasn't cheap. The 746 and 746 Pro was considerably cheaper. It was like under two. So anyway, but the thing is that like people are convinced that they absolutely have to have the latest, greatest, most expensive, almost top tier radio in order to have fun on the radio. And it just doesn't make sense. But maybe I'm looking at it from a different perspective. Now, I like high dollar radios. I like expensive stuff, but I also don't like paying that for them. So what I've always done was I've looked for older stuff that was really expensive. Like, for example, I don't know if you can see it in the background, but there actually is a 756 Pro on top of a TS940. The TS940, when it came out, was pretty expensive. That was Kenwood's flagship radio. And if you want one like that nowadays, which most people don't, you can usually get them for a pretty reasonable price, and you'll probably have to do some repairs. But that's always been my approach. Like, I'm not going to go out and spend, $5,000 for FTDX 101 MP. Like, I'll be honest with you, it would be nice to have a 200 watt radio versus a 100 watt radio. Like, I think that's kind of the sweet spot, because then you don't even need an amplifier. And I don't usually use an amplifier. I've got several of them, but like when I operate, I don't usually use one because I focus on my antenna before I worry about the radio or any of the other stuff. And so that's kind of like more important than any amount of money you're going to spend on a radio, because it's like a car with no wheels. Okay, you're not going nowhere. A car with bald tires, however you want to look at the analogy. So you don't need to invest a whole ton of money in an antenna either to have a good antenna, and you can also operate on a compromised antenna and still have a lot of fun and make a lot of contacts. I used to operate portable and mobile more than I did at home. And what I have, I could tell you what to put up. I could tell you what I think is the best antenna, but ultimately, like, you got to figure out what's going to fit for where you're at, what's going to be the easiest thing, the most affordable thing. I won't run anything except for a loop antenna if at all possible. It doesn't need to be up real high. I have 270 feet of wire up, 20 feet ish. It varies because it's leftover poles from a Step IR antenna, and then I have a couple of Home Depot top rails. So they're 11 feet each, and they're stacked together, and they're in the ground. I don't know how far, not far. And that just kind of holds the loop up around the house. And I'm on a city lot, so I mean, I've got room for it. And it's not really visible at all if you don't notice the poles. So, and if I lived somewhere that was a little more normal, where the power lines don't run in the backyard, I'd be able to hide it completely. Because the way they do it here where I'm at in Arizona, the power lines run between the back, there's like a back alley. They've kind of got it a little goofy out here. They can't drive through this one. But like in other areas of Arizona, down in Phoenix and Chandler and stuff like that, they actually go between the alleyway, and that's where the garbage cans go in certain places. And I think the power lines are all doing that. So they came up with this idea, like, we want the power lines behind the houses so they're out of sight, or so drunk drivers won't hit them. I don't know. But anyway, that's how they do it. So I would have my antenna further towards the backyard if it wasn't for that. But you got to stay away from those power lines. And it's not just for safety; it's for noise and other stuff like that. So anyway, but you can run a vertical antenna, a ham stick on a garbage can. You know, I mean, you can run an attic dipole. I mean, there's a bunch of different things you could do. And obviously, you don't want to run power if you're not running a really good tuned antenna. And a tuner is not the solution to a good antenna. The tuner is something to fool the radio into thinking that the antenna is resonant where you want to operate. Not all antennas are resonant, but all antennas will resonate somewhere to some degree. And they'll have multiples of that frequency, which, you know, when they talk about a dipole and they say, well, this dipole resonates on this frequency and it has this harmonic here and there and there, it means that it'll work on multiple bands, but it's a compromise. It's going to work good here, okay here, and, you know, so forth. But you don't need this expensive radio and all this crazy stuff. I mean, you can sit here and throw a wire up on the roof of your house and lay it flat and transmit whisper, you know, or FT8, like 5 watts, and make contacts all over the world, okay? All over the place. Now, it's a different story trying to get on 80 meters or something like 160. You know, the antenna is pretty critical there. But, you know, for the most part, I stay away from dipoles because although they work well, they like to be up high. And they're supposed to be a quarter wave above ground. Think about what that would really be on 160 and 80 and 40 and 20. On 10 meters, that's not so bad, you know, but some of the low bands, it's unrealistic for most of us to put an antenna up over 100 feet. You know, how are you going to do that unless you have really good trees? So, I like a loop antenna because it really doesn't care as much. And actually, there's a sweet spot where you get it kind of low to the ground, and it really attenuates a lot of the bullshit and the man-made noise. And that's why people will tell you a loop antenna is quieter. So, if you get it up really high, it starts to pick up a lot more noise. And there's a point where the noise floor versus the signal you're trying to hear kind of, you know, becomes a wash. So I think 20 feet is pretty good, but if you can only put up a loop 5 feet or put it on along the fence around your house, it's going to work. You just have to play around with it and don't be discouraged and think it won't work because it will. And you don't have to have a balance line tuner. And don't fall into that bullshit where these guys tell you. Unless you're trying to like run 1,000 feet of fucking coax to something, you know, the advantages of ladder line are really not that important if you're going under 100 feet. You know, anything over 100 feet, that's you start to see some pretty serious losses. Um, and also the feed line starts to do all kinds of weird stuff. But um, you'll have to try that and figure it out. But if you're going to have an antenna that's that far away, you probably have a lot of property anyways, and so you're already in a good position. So, but my suggestion is you keep your feed point as close to your radio as possible and have the shortest length of transmission line as possible. And another reason for that is because if anything is wrong, the transmission line becomes part of the antenna. So the shorter that is, the less interaction it has with the radio and other things like that. Um, and the other thing that I prefer is stranded wire over solid wire because of what's called the skin effect. And the skin effect is how RF travels on a wire, and solid core wire only offers a certain amount of surface area for the same equivalent gauge of stranded wire. In the stranded wire, you have multiple small strands, and they all have surface on them. And so the RF is able to cover more area, and you end up with a wider, broad-banded antenna. So for bands like 80 meters, let's say you can tune the thing from 3.8 megahertz to 3.9 if you're using 12 gauge solid copper wire, and then you go to 12 gauge stranded, you may be able to cover down to, I don't know, maybe 3.750 up to, 3950 or something. You're going to gain a little bit of bandwidth. I don't know how much it is, but you will. Um, and so that definitely helps because, on those lower bands, having more bandwidth, um, if you understand what I'm saying, the antenna is broad-banded. It it's not like a Hustler 5B TV on 80 meters with that coil. Anytime that you have an antenna with a loading coil to make up for physical length with electrically, you're going to have a narrow-banded antenna. So trap coils and all that stuff make antennas narrow-banded. I don't know any instance where they don't, but I'm not an expert on that. But you always want to try and have as much wire up in the air as possible. And with the way that I do, like a loop antenna, I put up as much wire as I can, and then I'll fiddle with it and try and get it to a certain length that like wants to play well with the radio. And I like to get it to where the automatic antenna tuner and a 100-watt antenna tuner in the radio can tune this thing. I don't like to have to use a manual antenna tuner, because then I can jump from this band to this band and push the button on the radio and tune, and boom, I'm there. And also, another thing that I do is I use a nano VNA to look at the antenna's pattern and where it wants to resonate at. And even if it's like 7-1 somewhere, well, that's better than 50-1. Some kind of resonance, because you have all these other factors involved. And, just because it looks really bad doesn't mean it won't work. You're not going to be 1-1 on everything. And you'll never be 1-1 on anything with a loop anyway. You'll be more like 1.9 or 2. But SWR is not the end all be all. So, but the main thing, the takeaway from this that I'm trying to get across here is that you can buy a cheap ass radio, you can put up a cheap crappy antenna, and you can have a lot of fun on the radio, and you don't need to have like all this fancy equipment that everybody thinks that they need to have. It's stupid. find an old radio on Craigslist, Facebook Marketplace, maybe even QRZ, fix it up, learn how to work on radios, learn how to build an antenna, learn how to figure out how things work, and you'll never need to worry about buying another radio from, someplace brand new. You'll never have to worry about having to have somebody else figure out stuff for you. You know, I think that I hear all these guys. Oh, I just sent my amp off. I sent my radio off. That's not ham radio. In the spirit of ham radio, back in the day, I mean, I guess it's changed into something different, but I don't know. So I can't relate to that because I'm just like, well, and then with the new radios, like I get it. You have a 101 and the new 101, which why couldn't they have named that thing something else? Like all they're doing is just negating and taking away from the legendary 101. You're like, oh, we're going to regurgitate the 101 name. We're going to call it the FTDX. Anyway, I wish they hadn't done that. But anyway, back on to target here. The 101, you're not going to fix that. The 7610, you're not going to fix that. None of these new radios, you're not going to fix it unless it's like something simple. Or you're skilled in surface mount repair. And a lot of this stuff, it's so bad now. Surface mount is not new. They just replaced the entire fucking board. There's a lot of this stuff people can't even work on. It's all the board is assembled by a computer, so it's not. Humans aren't even capable of like doing this crap really for the most part. But if you have older equipment, you can fix it, and that's the thing. It's like, and you can always set up something like SDR Play and run a really nice display that's going to be better than any of these radios, really. I don't think that any of the current radios that are being sold offer the resolution that you will have on a computer using the SDR Play running SDR Uno. The only radio that I can think of that would be a Flex radio. But surely not the 7300 and the 710. And if you look at the 710, I don't know what the output to the display is, but it's really, really bad. And when you look at the display on the 710, it's pretty good. But as soon as you hook that to a monitor, it gets kind of like looking like Minecraft. It's very pixeled. It's not fine. It's not nice looking. You lose resolution. And the new 7300, I don't know what that's going to be like. The 101, these all have really nice displays on the radio for their given size. But on a full-size monitor, they lack. They're not on par with a modern SDR receiver. They're just not. So you're better to have a really high-quality older radio and a pan adapter. And if you're in the right year of things, you can have the radio track with your SDR and it can follow it, or you can use the SDR as an independent receiver. And depending on what radio you have, well, you can just plug it right in the back of the radio and it'll go through your radio's front end. You get a little even more filtering. But honestly, I don't really think that these radios are worth the money. I could hear a guy on an 891 Yaesu and a guy on a 101 with the same setup, and they sound exactly the same to me. So you can buy a $700 radio or you can buy a $5,000 radio, and at the end of the day, most people are not going to be impressed anymore by one radio or the other. And you're not going to hear a big difference between the receiver. So it's down to personal choices and what you want. Like, do you want all the knobs on the radio and not have to go into a menu like the 710? Well, then you probably want the 101. So if you've got that kind of money to spend, then go for it. But I don't, and I'm not going to spend that kind of money on a radio, because I just, I don't see the point in it. You know, 10 years from now, maybe I'll buy one used when they're like, $900 or something. Or who knows, they might not ever go down that low. Um, but anyway, so you don't need all this fancy stuff. That's my point. And everybody seems to be convinced that they do. And you need to stop relying on other people to solve your problems for you. The point of being an amateur radio operator is to learn how to do things on your own. So, anyway, that's it for me, guys. I'll catch you all later.